Great to have everyone here today. I think you all are familiar with the work that we're doing through the Department of Forestry in collaboration with our federal and state sister agencies. Really important work and a priority both for the Department of Forestry as well as with our state and federal partners. So it's really an exciting time to be working on this habitat conservation plan. There's been a lot accomplished, and you'll hear some of that today. Want to really emphasize that for us, we really put a lot of importance and value in the public engagement process. So truly appreciate you being here and look forward to more of the same. So with that, turn it over.
Thank you. And you'll see us do a bit of this microphone handing back and forth. After I do the agenda and overview, Jason, I was going to also let you tell folks what's happening with the online and the in-room piece, okay? But first of all, hello, I'm Deb Noodleman, part of the Kearns and West facilitation team and part of the project team, and also here on behalf of Oregon Consensus. And even before we jump into the agenda, we'd love to know who all of you are. So we'll head around the room and then back to the rest of the table. And so, hello. Hi. Oh yeah, thank you for that, Sylvia. This, it should just come right off. Oh.
Thank you. I'm Bob Reese, representing the Association Northwest Steelheaders and Northwest Guides and Anglers Association.
I'm Joe Kirkfleet, Oregon State University and Trout Unlimited.
Hi, I'm Susan Morgan with the Association of Oregon Counties.
Good afternoon, Ken McCall from Oregon Hunters Association.
Hello, Amy Patrick, and I'm also with OHA.
I'm Rob Lindblad. I used to work for the Department of Forestry.
Mark Maleeson, Oregon Department of Forestry.
Hi, I'm Kim Kratz. I'm the Assistant Regional Administrator, Oregon Washington Coastal Office, NOAA Fisheries.
Rich Schlemp, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Barrett Brown, State Forest Advisory Committee.
Bob Van Dyke, Wild Salmon Center.
Hi, I'm Jim Muck from NOAA Fisheries out of Roseburg.
Hi, Don Everingham. I work for the Department of Forestry out of our Northwest Oregon area office in Forest Grove.
Wow, great timing for once. Hi, Bill Ryan, Deputy Director at State Lands.
Hello, I'm Terry Stouter, private landowner, Lincoln County, Oregon.
Nancy Pestis, Department of State Lands.
Good afternoon. I'm Joe Monks with Northwest Hardwoods. We have 2 sawmills in Washington or Oregon and 1 in Washington that employ about 150 people that depend on state timber. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Phippen. I'm the Oregon Coast Branch Chief, NOAA Fisheries.
Yeah, Mike Barsodia, family forest landowner and president, Oregon Small Woodlands Association.
I'm Dave Ivanoff, representing Hampton Lumber.
Mark Rasmussen with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard.
Hi, Shonda Fry with Trout Unlimited.
Oh boy. Hi, my name's Rod Kramer, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Julie Furman. I'm also with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Hi, I'm Michelle Bardini, Kearns and West.
Jason Cox, ODF, and I'll explain why we're holding these. So we're actually live streaming this meeting to the website. And do we have another introduction we should do first? Should I go for it? Okay. All right. Got him. So we are live streaming this meeting to the web. So if there's something, folks who couldn't be here, if there's something you missed later, it'll be archived on our YouTube page. And so this microphone is for the benefit of making sure everybody interested around the world can hear us loud and clear.
Okay, great. Liz Dent, I'm the State Forest Division Chief with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Good to see y'all.
Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Kolomaychuk, and I'm the project manager for the Western Oregon HCP, also with ODF.
Hi, everyone. I'm Troy Ramick with ICF, and I'm the project manager for the HCP technical team.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brett Brownscombe with Oregon Consensus, and we're out of Portland State University in the Hatfield School of Government, and this is part of the process, kind of independent, neutral process side of managing the HCP effort.
And Sylvia Chiborowski with Kearns and West.
All right. And said it to most of you, but to the folks that just arrived, Deb Noodleman, also Kearns and West. All right. So good afternoon. And thank you so much for making time to be here today. We really appreciate it. I'm going to take just a few minutes, walk you through the agenda, tell you about the materials, a few bits of housekeeping and logistics, and we'll jump right in. Please tell us in the room if we're not speaking loud enough, just wave an arm and let us know. But if you pull out your blue agenda on top of the packet, we really have three main topics today. Some of you were at the first kickoff meeting, which was in March. This is now the second open meeting to the public on behalf of the project. I call it the project, but it's the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Planning effort. And our interest today at a high level to share more information on the HCP process itself. So there are quite a number of updates. And for those of you that have been here before, and we hope to see all of you as much as possible, you'll start to see a bit of a pattern of where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going in the HCP development process. And we work as hard as we can, and the we means the project team on behalf of all of you, to really make sure that there's a common foundation of information, and that during these meetings, we have the time to also hear from you. What are your questions? What are your concerns? What do you want to talk about here? And what do you want to talk about between each of these meetings as we proceed throughout the process? So for today's meeting, kind of three big buckets. The first is all the updates on what work's been happening in the HCP development process, and Troy's going to walk you through all that. You see it on the agenda. The second really big topic is the Western Oregon HCP mission, vision, and goals. And Liz is going to help explain what those are, why they've been developed, where they're at, and what our interests are, what ODF's interest is in visiting with you about them. And the third piece is the stakeholder engagement plan. And Sylvia is going to walk you through the plan that's been developed. We always keep it in a draft format because we want this to be a living document with all of you and have it really work to resonate and to make sure that your voices get heard throughout the process. So she'll walk you through what we have proposed to all of you. And for all three of these topics, we're really excited to be engaging with you today. So thank you both in the room, and for those of you listening in, we're happy to be here. We'll do all that in this 1 to 3 time frame. And what we like to do is make this the more formal information sharing, question answer, group discussion piece. And then we leave this last hour from 3 to 4 as an informal time where all of your steering committee, scoping team, and project team members stay. And they really want to have a chance to talk with you one-on-one. And I'm trying a little bit of an encouragement to have you talk with people you don't know as well. I mean, you're not disallowed. You can still talk to the people you do know, but we really are kind of trying to spread the information sharing and issues and concerns. So anyway, that's the 1 to 4 time frame. Anybody questions on the agenda? Okay, so then in your packet, we're hoping this works for you. We have the mission, vision, goals here for you to look at, and we'll talk about it, the stakeholder engagement plan, the slides that you're going to be seeing. And we want to let you know also that you're always welcome to go. It's down at the bottom of the agenda to the ODF website. And all of these documents are always posted there, and other documents from the meetings that have been going on. So feel free to look there, and we hope that helps too. Just a couple other quick pieces. We facilitator types always happen to have ground rules. So the ones we picked for today we thought were relevant. Honor the agenda, which is these are the topics we really need to stay focused on. Listen to understand and ask questions to clarify. So, keep that open mind. Don't presume you know what somebody's saying and why they're saying it. Ask those questions to really make sure that you can check it out. Balance of speaking time. So if some of you are asking a lot of questions, we may not call on you as much, and we may even randomly look to some of you to ask questions, and we'll just try to get all this expertise in the room shared as much as possible. We will take as many questions as we can during this formal time, and if for some reason they don't get covered, make sure there's comment cards at each table, and please share any extra either information or questions or anything else you want to say on those cards. And then sharing your interests and learning about each other's interests. You'll probably hear this theme a lot at the front end of a process. It's a really key way to try to see that the deliverables at the end of the process work for people. So we're going to keep asking those questions over and over. Are we understanding your interests? Are you sharing them? Are you understanding others? And are they starting to be represented as you see this HCP development process occur? And then the last one is just kind of the pet peeve. Try to avoid side conversations so you don't miss anything as you're listening. And then also either turn off your cell phones, put them away, do your best not to look at them. I know it's hard, but just try. And that's it. Okay, thank you. Restrooms are out the door and to your right as you exit. What else? There's lovely snacks. There's beverages and snacks off to the side. Oh, sign in. And if you didn't sign in yet, just make sure to do it sometime before you leave and try to grab a name tag just for conversation. Did I forget anything? Am I good? Anybody else, team? No? All right. Troy, you're up. Yeah, here you go.
And I think it'll work best if we actually dim the lights because I have a few slides that have maps and stuff. And so I'm going to sit because I feel like if I stand, I'll be in somebody's way. So apologies for that. But thanks again for coming, everybody. I'm going to do spend a little time. It's really dark. Sorry about that. It's okay. It's okay. You just can't sleep.
But we did try to get as much air conditioning as possible. So this is cool.
It's fine. And we can adjust them if you can't see stuff, that's fine. I'm going to do, I think, 3 things today. One is, and sticking with the theme that Deb just mentioned, I'm going to touch back on a couple of things we talked about last time. There have been a few updates to kind of the scope and scale of the HCP that I want to just review with you. Then I'm going to spend a few slides just doing a little bit of a deeper dive on what is going to be in the HCP and kind of when that's going to be coming and happening. We did talk about that at a high level last time, but I wanted to put some more words to it so it was a little bit more meaningful. And then the last section, I'll just touch on what we're doing now. So you have some sense of kind of the work in progress. So that's the plan for today. To start with, I want to bring you back to this graphic, which we talked about, you've seen before, we talked about before, but this is really just the overview of the kind of whole process. And just always like to touch on the fact kind of where we are in the process, just so that you know, still very much in the beginning of it, of course, developing the HCP, and there's a lot more to come throughout the rest of this year and into early next year. And then of course the NEPA process to follow on that. Later today, Deb and Sylvia are going to talk in more detail about the stakeholder engagement, which is represented here. So more to come on that. And then of course, as we go along, there will be continued check-ins with FTLAC and the Board of Forestry, and we've shown those here as well. So many more occasions to see information like this in different venues, and we're going to talk more about that later. So just to touch back on a couple of things we all talked about last time, and this may be new for some of you, and if it is, I'm not going to cover it in great detail because we've done that already, but we can circle back to it in Q&A if we need to. But just a couple of quick updates on the geographic coverage, the permit term, covered activities, and covered species. There's been a lot of work going on around these topic areas, and so I just wanted to kind of bring you up to date on that. And first on the geographic area, a reminder that this HCP covers all ODF managed lands except, so that's Board of Forestry lands and Common School lands, but not the Elliott State Forest Common School lands. That's of course on a separate HCP process. And I'll show you a couple of maps in a second about that. What's been happening since last time we talked, I think when we talked last time, the permit area and plan area was very much in flux. We were sort of trying to figure out, what does the plan area look like? So the permit area is easy. That's where ODF is currently doing activities and needs permit coverage for those activities on both, again, Board of Forestry lands and Common School lands. But we also know that over the course of the permit term, there will be land exchanges and acquisitions, and things are going to be happening in places that are currently not managed by ODF. And so we have to account for that somehow as part of our plan area. And that's what we've been working on since the last time we got together. And I have a series of maps that I'll show you because I know you can't see this one, and we may want to dim the lights for this a little bit more. But essentially what's shown on this map is the permit area and the plan area. The permit area is kind of the solid colored areas, so the blue and the pink, blue being Board of Forestry lands, pink being common school lands. And then I will zoom in on these areas so you can see them a little bit more closely. But we have kind of a purple boundary around the permit area, and that's the plan area. And those are places where, again, there's likely to be, or potentially could be, land exchanges or acquisitions over time. When you zoom in on that, I have a few slides doing that in a couple of different places. And this is really what it looks like kind of zoomed in. So this is up in Clatsop and Tillamook State Forests. You can see here that the plan area actually maps onto the permit area pretty closely. So there's not a lot of space between the permit area and the plan area up here. That's frankly because that land is already pretty blocked up. There's a few inholdings and places in there where there could be acquisitions or exchanges, but not a lot of activity in that realm over time likely. But in other places, like in Western Lane County, you can see more of a checkerboard pattern. Again, the blue Board of Forestry lands there, and then the white or grayish color that could either be private or federal lands. We didn't differentiate between those on these maps, but you can see just operationally, and if you've been involved in any work out there and other places like this, that operationally, sometimes activities, move across ownership boundaries. And this is a place where you could see land exchanges or acquisitions occurring and being beneficial to both state forests and, potentially private and federal entities as well, as you try to kind of block up and make management a little bit easier. So in places like this, it makes sense to have a plan area boundary that kind of goes around all those ownership blocks. And we do something similar, and you can see a few of the other locations there in the north and south on the coast. Something similar in the Santiam State Forest. So this is what the boundary currently looks like there. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned it, but these boundaries are all based on the land exchange and acquisition plans that the districts have worked out over the years. So there's the boundary is certainly founded in a lot of work over time. And then as you go down to the southwestern part of the state, you can see here an example where we get in kind of more of the scattered track areas, and there's a lot of common school lands down there, and sometimes single sections or even smaller. So it gives you some sense of the ownership patterns and how management activities are occurring. In those cases, you can see that the plan area and permit area is basically the same. So that's one thing that we've been working on, and we feel pretty good about that boundary. There are still conversations happening about, just making sure that we have contemplated all of those potential areas that may change hands over time, or all of the areas where ODF activities may be happening over time, because under this HCP, that is the goal, is to cover ODF's activities wherever they occur, basically, if we can. So nothing new really to report on covered activities. You saw this list last time or something similar, very similar to it. One thing we are doing on covered activities now is taking a pretty deep dive with the districts and just making sure that as we describe these activities in the HCP, that we're capturing the full suite of actions that they do on the ground. So I show you, some high level bullets here, and obviously there's a lot more detail as we go through this working with the districts, but we want to make sure that we're fully understanding how the activities are occurring, because eventually we'll be taking that information and thinking about how might it, what's the potential for it to impact the species, the covered species. On the species side, only one change to report, and I might have even talked about this the last time we were together, but we have been going through the process of selecting the covered species as we talked about before, kind of the standard selection criteria that are shown on the screen here. And the only change that has happened, I think, between the last time we talked and now is we have removed one species from the list, and that's the Lower Columbia steelhead. So Lower Columbia steelhead distribution, it literally just goes across one small common school land parcel. That's the only place where it intersects with state forest lands. And so the thought there was, number one, the impacts would probably be quite low and likely could even be avoided. And number two, even if we wanted to do mitigation or conservation for that species, we'd be pretty limited in what we could do, what we could accomplish on that single parcel. So as we talked about it with the scoping team and the steering committee, we decided to remove Lower Columbia steelhead, but everything else is the same. So 15 species, 8 fish, and 7 wildlife, which you can see here. And if you have any additional questions about that, we can cover it a little bit later. So a few slides here just talking about what is in the HCP. We sort of throw around a lot of information and we have lots of graphics, and that's all very helpful. But I thought it would be useful for us today, as we're now kind of getting into this process, to just explain in a little bit more detail what is actually in the HCP, where it's going to show up, and approximately when in the process it's going to show up. So you have some sense of where we're headed. And I think that way, as we have discussions later and questions arise, some of your questions may actually be answered later in the process. And so we can talk about that. I kind of divide this into just a few key categories: kind of background information, effects, conservation strategy and monitoring, and then alternatives to take and implementation, and then cost and funding. And I'll walk through each of those now. We're working on background information now. I'm going to explain that a little bit more at the end. But basically what that means is we're working on the kind of what and why of the HCP. So why are we doing it? What are the program goals? We're going to hear about that in the next segment of the meeting today. And what's the regulatory charge of the HCP? And that's all discussed and will be discussed in chapter 1 of the HCP. And then the next two chapters, and I talk about it kind of chapter by chapter, which you've heard me do before, because that really is kind of how it plays out. It really has to do with the background, the environmental setting information, kind of the background information, the physical and ecological information of the plan area. And I'll show you some maps later that kind of describe what I'm talking about there. That includes information about the covered species. So what do we know about the species, including what are the gaps for the covered species in terms of conservation, and what do we know about them that's going to inform our effects analysis later in time. And then the third part of the background is really the covered activities. And I talked about that already a second ago, and we're working pretty closely with the ODF districts on those covered activities, what they are, what frequency do they occur, what methods are used, all of the things that you can imagine would be important when you're asking the question, how do those activities potentially impact the covered species? So that's kind of the background information. And then as we get that set up, we start to ask the question, well, how do those activities influence or have the potential to affect those covered species? Because that's really what we're after here, is the interaction between the covered activities on the ground and the covered species as we understand them. And what does that look like over the course of the permit term? And then we're charged with coming up with a conservation strategy to offset those effects. That's basically the crux of the HCP. And we do that in the middle few chapters of the HCP, the conservation strategy, which includes both avoidance and minimization measures. And then for things that cannot be avoided and minimized, we may have to do some mitigation. We may have to do some sort of active conservation for those species. And all of those three things, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation, are described in the conservation strategy. And we're working on those things now, including biological goals and objectives, which I'll get to at the end. And then kind of in parallel with that, we're also thinking about, as we learn more about the covered activities and start to feel comfortable about what those are, what they look like, and that we've captured everything, we're also working on how will those activities impact the covered species or potentially impact the covered species? And that's the effects analysis. So we put the conservation strategy first because the conservation strategy really, we're avoiding and minimize as much as we can. And that influences how the activities are done on the ground, but we know that some mitigation will need to occur. So we work on those things in parallel, and they heavily influence one another along the way, for sure. And both of those things are just sort of getting started now as we get the baseline set and the background information set, and then learned about the covered activities. And then finally, while we set up the conservation strategy and we have all these grand plans about what we're going to do, we also have to know, does it work, or is it working over time? Over time. And we'll have an entire chapter devoted to a monitoring program that will basically answer that question. So is ODF in compliance with the HCP? Are they implementing the HCP as it's written? And then are those conservation actions that we have included in the conservation strategy, are they effectively contributing to the conservation of the species as we thought they would? So that's what the monitoring program is all about. And that'll be coming later this year. So just in terms of timing, baseline is starting to take shape. I think we starting to feel pretty good about the baseline information. The effects analysis and conservation strategy, that's work that will be happening sort of through the summer into the fall. And then the monitoring program and the implementation and a few things I'm going to talk about next are going to be happening sort of towards the end of 2019 and into early 2020. And on that note, once we have a pretty good understanding of the conservation strategy and the effects analysis and the monitoring program, we also start to think about how will this HCP be implemented? You know, how will ODF implement this over time? And we have to describe that in the HCP. We also have a whole chapter on, which we talked about at the last meeting, and I won't go into today, but about assurances and alternatives to take. We have to describe that as well. And then finally, one of the bigger questions is how much is it all going to cost? So it is a requirement that we describe how much it's going to cost or estimate how much it's going to cost, and then also describe the funding strategy for the HCP. And that'll have a standalone chapter. And the key cost centers related to the HCP are shown here. How much is it going to cost to administer the program as it's written? What's the habitat management and restoration look like, and how much is that going to cost? The monitoring program, which I've already mentioned, there's going to be reporting required, of course, on the monitoring. And then finally, some allowances for what happens if things change over time and how do we manage the whole program adaptively. And we have to contemplate how much that might cost as well. So it's a pretty robust cost and funding exercise, and it is a required element of the HCP process. And the last time we were together, I basically said much of that, but just in one graphic. And so this is kind of a graphic of just the HCP process, more or less a chapter by chapter way of thinking about it. I've lumped some things together here, but it does give you a sense of kind of the sequence of events over the next 9 or 11 months or so. And as I mentioned, where we are in the process now, you can see we're sort of starting to get the first 3 kind of baseline or environmental setting things sorted out, and just starting on the conservation strategy and the effects analysis. So that's where things sit. More specifically, the kind of what we're doing, now, just to give you a little bit more of a flavor of what that work looks like and what the environmental setting and other things really includes. So it includes all sorts of background information. I mentioned sort of physical and biological or ecological resources, really characterizing the plan area, including sort of some of the historical events and historical land uses that influence the forest that we now have today on state lands, and what does that mean for all of our covered species. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. And then lastly, the life history and distribution, et cetera, of our covered species. And so what is kind of the best available science on covered species? What do we know about them in terms of, how they use the natural environment, what habitats they use? And again, that'll be important when we start thinking about how the covered activities might influence those species. Now, I will say that as it relates to all of this, really, this isn't necessarily like a PhD dissertation. It's not going to be like a 5,000-page document. It is very much a summary of existing information. And we try to keep it that way. We try to keep it at a level that is readable and understandable, and reference, current literature and other resources as appropriate. So it's not going to be a tome, but there's a lot of information available out there on all these species and all these resources. And so it is a pretty involved process to pull it all together. So just a couple of quick examples, and Brett, if you could dim the lights for a second on this one. So I have a couple of maps. So just the way we're thinking about the environmental setting, first of all, is really more sort of from an ecoregion perspective. And so what we're showing here, I think you made it worse. Yeah, you can turn them all off. It'll just be brief. So the colors you see on the map here are just basically the different ecoregions. And so, there's lots of different ways to think about state forest lands in the western part of the state. of course, there's districts and counties and all these other things, but from an ecological perspective, it makes sense to think about it from an ecoregion perspective. So we're showing basically the 4 ecoregions here where we have parts of the plan area. Of course, most of the plan area is in the coast ecoregion. There are bits in the Willamette and the Cascades and even down in the Klamath ecoregion. So we are thinking about it sort of through that lens because that does have an influence on the forests and the resources that are in those areas. And then there are other things that we're thinking about and describing as well, like things like fire. How has fire shaped the landscape that we know today, and what has happened after fire, and other land uses, and then things like disease and storms. So there's a lot that's happened over time that has shaped the forest that we know today and has influenced the way the forest is supporting our covered species now. And so we try to paint that picture. Again, we're not writing a book on it, but we're trying to provide enough detail that it gives you context when you read it. And then things like precipitation also driving, differences, ecological differences out there in our plan area. So another example of a physical, piece of data that influences how we talk about the forest. And there's many others. I'm just throwing out a few kind of examples here, but there's many others. On the species side, the first thing we're doing is thinking about the distribution of species as it relates to state land. So I have a few examples here, and of course there are examples for all of the covered species, but as we go through the process of thinking about the conservation strategy for each of the covered species, it's important to think about what can we accomplish for those species in the plan area, or what can we accomplish for those species on state lands. And for some species, we have more opportunities than others just based on their distribution. So I'm showing a couple here. So here's Oregon Coast coho distribution. And it's a little hard to see, but you can, the orange, remember the orange and the purple outline is the plan area. So you can see in a couple of places our plan area kind of embedded in that larger distribution. And then the same, another example here of the Upper Willamette River winter run steelhead. So pretty large distribution, and we have, some opportunities in Santiam and a few other scattered opportunities. This all becomes important later as we start to think about where do we want to prioritize conservation for these species? Where can we have the biggest impact or the biggest benefit for them? And then as we think about the potential for the covered activities to influence the species, this context is also important. And there's no magic here in terms of distribution. We're not creating any new science necessarily. We're not jumping to conclusions very much. We're just mostly reporting the news, looking at published distributions and published literature and just trying to represent that in the best way we can. Now, some other species, this is on the wildlife side. This is Oregon slender salamander. It gets a little bit more interesting because we don't know as much about some of these wildlife species. So you can see this is the range of the species, which I know looks a little bit funny, but that's sort of the published range of the species and based on occurrence information. And the plan area within that range basically is, the Santiam State Forest and surrounding parcels. And we have a little bit of occurrence information for the species scattered around, but not a lot of additional occurrence information. So in cases like this, we probably will, and what we're thinking about right now is we probably will have to do some work to think about how does the plan area support the species? What does the habitat for that species look like across the plan area, and use some of that information from the studies and the surveys that have been done, and make some inferences about the habitat over time. And sometimes we use habitat models for that. Other times there's published information about that. And so that is something we have to do as we think about, again, what are the potential impacts of the covered species on the covered species, and then what are our conservation opportunities. And then another example, this is the Columbia torrent salamander, another one of our salamander species, an aquatic salamander species. And in this case, same thing, big range, only a little bit of survey information for that, kind of a targeted study for that species. And so again, an example where we're going to have to make some inferences. We know that's not the only place that species occurs. It occurs throughout its range, and we have to make some inferences about where, and then what does that mean in terms of impacts and conservation. So just a little bit of a smattering of some of the background information that we're starting to generate. And again, kind of just reporting the news here, not taking too many leaps with the science, but really just sticking to the published literature. Sure. Yeah. Cool. Well, the only place where there's publicly available survey information that we have, and I guess this would be a good time to say if there's other information out there, we're welcome to take it from you. But that's right. So this in terms of public survey information that's available. Potentially, it depends on, so if we were to, for example, do a habitat model for that species, it would depend on, some of the how would I call it? The nuances of the landscape, right? So in this case, this is an aquatic salamander. So we're looking at basically streams, upper reaches of streams. And so we might ask ourselves, where in what other streams throughout the range of the species might they occur based on the typical habitat conditions that they utilize. So that might involve things like, slope, water temperature, the forestry, the forest, the characterization of the forest around those aquatic resources. So there would be, several other parameters that we would try to layer on to zoom in on those areas that are most likely to support the species. That's what we're after. We don't know yet. That's a good question. One of the things we try to accomplish with these regional long-term HCPs is to minimize the amount of surveys that have to happen on the back end unless it relates to the monitoring program. So we may, in some cases, as part of our monitoring program, have some targeted surveys that occur either at the species level or at the habitat level, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So we don't know. So then finally, just a couple of additional thoughts here on what we're doing these days. I mentioned this kind of throughout, but as we think through this background information, we're also thinking about, what are the gaps in the knowledge? What are the conservation needs as we can easily identify them for the covered species? And those are things that, if appropriate, we'll try to address those in the HCP. And in some cases, the conservation needs of the species may go well beyond what we can accomplish on state lands. And so that's something that we're trying to think about. We're beginning to think about biological goals and objectives, and that is sort of the heart of the conservation strategy. I think I've characterized it that way before. It's sort of the very succinct statements about what we hope to accomplish. What world do we want to live in as it relates to these species over time? And the objectives become the very quantifiable part of that, when we set up a monitoring program over time, the intention is to be able to answer the question, are we achieving the objectives as they were written? And so we're just kind of getting started on that process and thinking about those biological goals and objectives. And then part of that is how do we achieve the objectives? What conservation actions are going to be the most effective? And again, that relates to, where the species is relative to state lands, what habitat conditions are on state lands, and what we can achieve over time. And then other things like how much of the range of the species is actually on state lands, and what are there limitations or opportunities there? And that's what we will consider. And then I mentioned previously, also at the same time, thinking about the effects analysis. So as we hone in on the specifics of the covered activities and what that's going to look like on the landscape, and balance that against what we now are learning and know about the covered species, we can quantify those covered activities and think about the potential for them to result in take of the covered species, and then kind of right size the conservation strategy according to that, down later this summer is what will be happening. And then also make sure that as part of the conservation strategy, we can demonstrate that we're trying to avoid and minimize as much as we can. And that has to do with how the activities are done on the landscape. And in some cases we can do things to avoid and minimize, and other times we can't, and that's really why an HCP is needed. So that's my slides.
Comments, discussion, what comes to mind when you hear all the information Troy just shared? Sure. And if you don't mind saying your name again, so that
Mark Rasmussen. Does the effects analysis cover the effects on? Oh, I'm sorry. Will the effects analysis cover the effects on anything other than the covered species? Other uses of the forest?
So the effects analysis, so the question, I think everybody heard it, but will the effects analysis address effects on anything else in the forest besides covered species? So within the HCP, the purpose of the effects analysis is to address potential effects on the covered species. As a way of getting at that, we may be looking at effects on other types of natural resources. For example, it might not be specifically on a species, but maybe we're thinking about the stream environment generally, and then we connect the dots between that and covered species. But it will be on sort of the natural communities. That's what will be discussed in the HCP.
Social impacts.
So the question was, what about social impacts? That kind of information will be addressed through the NEPA process for sure. So when just in thinking about the potential implications of implementing the HCP as written, that's what the NEPA analysis is all about, is really analyzing potential impacts on the social environment and many other factors.
Oh, yeah, and as we're talking, Mark, maybe when we get into the mission, vision, goals statement, maybe think about that question in the context of after you've seen the mission, vision, goals, because those are speaking to social and economic issues that the HCP and the incidental take permit are trying to enable.
Kim Kratz. So I was thinking about Mark's question earlier about the distribution of individual species, and it's one way to look at that too is that a number of different species require the same ecological function, so that a management plan might be developed not for single individual species, but around the ecological needs of a group of species that might live in the same sorts of habitat. So the management plan is developed over a larger landscape than just the individual sample spots where they've found a species. So
the covered species then are representative, or how does that work?
Well,
you have a list of covered species.
I'm not saying that all covered species require the same ecological same ecological function. I'm saying that oftentimes the management's, and I'm not talking about HCPs in particular, I'm talking about what we do in NOAA fisheries. So a lot of times that, like using, for instance, fish, I mean, there may be slight differences in what steelhead need from Chinook need. So it's not that the management strategy, and they overlap. And so the management strategy that incorporates the needs of both of them may ultimately end up being the same, as opposed to tailoring management strategy for each individual species where they overlap. And salamanders are not ours.
Perhaps, Mark, a little more background. Oh, I'm sorry, Rich Schlemp, Fish and Wildlife Service. So the HCP is specifically intended to address impacts to the covered species, most of which are federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. So it's targeting those particular species because there's an incidental take prohibition. So that's why the species are limited, in part because ODF or any other landowner may need that incidental take permit coverage. So the HCP does not need to address those other species. It's intended to address those species that currently have some federal protection or may likely receive federal protection in the future because they might become listed like the salamanders. We don't know that yet, but it's a possibility. So, so hopefully that maybe helps answer your question as far as any other species out there that may or may not be benefited or adversely impacted. The NEPA process, which is different, will address other things, but it's not, you can't go into great detail about all the other potential species out there because there's, thousands of them. But the HCP targets those species for which incidental take coverage is being sought.
Is that Dave? Dave, do you have one? Okay, and then keep going.
Who else has questions so we know we'll get a ton of hand count? Okay, so 2 or 3 left to go. Go ahead.
Dave Ivanoff, and this is just an observation, and it's more out of ignorance that I asked this question, but it seems that the effects of the covered activities on covered species occurs in Chapter 5, and it seems to me that the order would be different. That should be Chapter 4, and the conservation strategy should follow the effects. Could you help me understand that?
Absolutely.
And then the follow-up question I have is it relates to the NEPA process and addressing the social impacts. What happens if the social impact is deemed to be so onerous that it requires a conservation strategy change? How does that work?
So I'll answer. This is louder than the other one, so I apologize. Back to my wireless mic. To answer your first question, Dave, we probably went back and forth on that 5 times. You know, what's first, the effects analysis, the conservation strategy. A lot of times on HCPs that we work on, we do have the effects analysis chapter first, followed by the conservation strategy. In this case, because we decided to do it with conservation strategy as chapter 4 and the effects analysis is chapter 5, because avoidance and minimization, which is part of the conservation strategy, well, I guess first of all, because everything is happening basically in a fixed landscape, right? So all of the covered activities and all of the potential conservation actions are going to be happening in a dynamic and fixed landscape. The difference being in another HCP where you might have all of your covered activity impacts here, and then you're doing all of your conservation over there. And so maybe it makes sense to talk about impacts first, and then we're going to mitigate by this much over here. But we're in this HCP, we're doing it all really within the same boundary. And so making sure that we understand the avoidance and minimization measures that are going to be, part of implementation of the covered activities, and how those reduce the potential for those activities to impact species, I think is critical as part of that conservation, that initially as part of that conservation strategy. So when we get to the effects analysis, that's already something we understand, and we can make sure that the effects analysis kind of reflects that. Now, the fact that they are, in that sort of sequence is a little bit of a misnomer, because you literally have to work on them both at the same time, and they do influence one another. And we'll likely be, as I mentioned, thinking about conservation strategies, and at the same time thinking about, well, what are the effects? And we'll be constantly, dialing in and trying to right size the conservation strategy to make sure that it's, just enough to offset the effects. So, there's nothing really magical about that sequence, and we do it both ways. On the NEPA question, I think you had a question about, the question was, what if you go through the NEPA process and there's an impact, whether it be social or something else, that causes a change, a significant change in what the HCP program looks like. So, that is literally what the NEPA process is for. And so if that were to happen, there is always, certainly we would be thinking about that as we develop the HCP along the way, and try never to get to that place. But if you did, there is the opportunity to always go back even after the public NEPA process and make changes to the HCP for sure. And then you have to make a decision if those changes are significant enough to do additional NEPA, or if you're already satisfied your NEPA requirement. But I've seen HCPs that for other reasons, not necessarily NEPA related, but even after they've gone through the NEPA process, where there have been pretty substantial changes, mostly cost related. So it turns out it costs more and wasn't economically feasible, or at least not, to the level that whatever the particular applicant was looking for. And so there can be changes later in the process if needed.
Follow up from Dave.
If I could please ask a follow-up, I guess the question would be, hypothetically, where this land is bordered on the south, and at the further south, it's surrounded by federal ownership that's in essentially a non-managed state, or it's being left to grow into older habitat. If there's a species that is in relative abundance on federal land, but for whatever reason on this state property, it may not have the same level of population experience that you have. But if you were to implement a strategy to have that same level on state land, but the impact would be so onerous on the local communities if that were to happen, then is securing an HCP on the state land then impossible if it's deemed in the NEPA process that this is going to have a huge impact on local communities?
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to address that if it occurs, I would say, but generally, I would say that there's hopefully going to be enough flexibility in the HCP in terms of, where, for example, conservation occurs or et cetera, that we wouldn't get to a place where we absolutely had to do this one thing in this one place, and then if we found that it was untenable for whatever reason, that would be tricky. But I think all of our species, even though some of our species are narrowly distributed in some cases, they're still broadly distributed enough that there should be enough opportunities, I think, across the landscape to do the level of conservation that we're going to need. And remember that we only are doing enough conservation or mitigation to offset any potential impacts. And we don't know the answer to that question yet, but in some cases it may not be that there are many impacts, but we still have to mitigate a little bit for them.
Anybody else?
Yeah, my questions concern the covered species. My name, Joe Kirkfleet. My questions concern the list of covered species. Just by way of preface, I think it's possible for an HCP to include species that may not be listed right now, but are candidates for listing. Or also species that it might not be listed for that particular area, but might come to be. So 3 questions. One, have you combed the list of candidate species and made sure that all of those that are relevant are on this list?
We have, yeah. And so when we went through the sort of covered species selection process, we were trying to get at a list that captured exactly what you described. And you're right, you can include not just species that are candidates, but also really any species that you think might be listed during the permit term. And so that's what we were trying to get at. And in terms of combing the list, I mean, there are some lists of species that are more likely, at least to be considered for listing in the future. We certainly looked at those. And then there are other species that are, I mean, the aquatic salamanders are things, for example, that, the kind of species that you can imagine as things change climatically and otherwise over time, those are the kinds of species that are likely to become more impacted by those changes. And so we include species like that because we assume that, maybe not even in the near term, but certainly decades down the road, there's a potential for them to be listed. At the same time, not to go on too much about it, but at the same time, we are also always trying to balance the list, right? And so, as I've said before, it's sometimes easy to say, well, let's just include everything, or let's include a very long list. It is, as we do that, it is required that we are effectively getting permits for each of those species, and we're treating each of those species in the HCP as if they are listed, even if they're not. So each species gets equal treatment, gets equal effects analysis and equal conservation strategy. So we have to be pretty comfortable that, or feel pretty good about the fact that they are likely to be listed, because we are committing to doing a certain level of conservation for them regardless. So there is a balancing act there.
Okay, so my other 2 questions are actually about 2 particular species that I'm wondering aren't on here. One would be bull trout, and the other one is the wolf. So I don't see either of those listed.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll mention wolf, and then maybe Mark, if you want to weigh in on bull trout, that might be helpful. So we've thought about wolf a lot. We've talked about it at the steering committee meeting. And our thoughts there were basically, we know wolves are, in Western Oregon, moving into Western Oregon, and likely are to move into Western Oregon more in the future. At this point in time, again, thinking about how much do we know about them on state lands, where they occur, and what the potential for impacts might be to them, we thought, we don't know enough right now to be very smart about that. And if we start to try to quantify what's the potential for take of those species on state lands, it's going to be pretty speculative and have to be fairly, general and conservative, not very meaningful. So really for that reason, if for nothing else, that's why we decided not to put wolf on the list. We did think that it's the kind of species that over time, if it turns out there are more wolves in Western Washington and packs show up and their den sites may be on state lands or something like that, and be the kind of species that if it became something that ODF was having to routinely deal with as part of their operations, because they would be basically avoiding take at that point, then that's an example of when you could amend the HCP to add an additional species. So that's the species that we kind of put in that category, is something that may become an issue down the road. It's hard to figure out when or how much of an issue. And if it does emerge as an issue, then there is a process to amend the HCP to include it. And then Mark might want to weigh in on bull trout.
Why, sure. The short answer is that we had one small parcel associated with bull trout, Dexter Reservoir in Western Lane, and that's it. So we made the same decision for another salamander species. When it's such a minuscule portion we're associated with, we felt we could minimize take through diligent management. Basically that was the conclusion. So it was on the list. It received full consideration, and after much deliberation, we decided that it wasn't necessary to include it.
Anybody else want to say anything about wolves from the scoping team, Rich, or anybody else on other issues?
Okay, we'll take one more because then we need to move on. Perfect.
Bob Reese, and along those same lines, I wondered about Pacific lamprey. What kind of consideration Pacific lamprey got through the process?
I'll throw it back to Mark again.
Don't you feel wanted?
Kinda. Yeah, so we gave that also full consideration, and the issue is, do we feel that will be listed in the near future? And gave it full deliberation. We've talked about that a fair bit, and our conclusion was that it wasn't necessary to put on the list at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot behind that. I'm just pretty much covering the surface.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think for now, any other questions, let's hold till the end.
We can circle back. Yep.
Yeah, and we'll come back.
So thank you. As Brett just said, if you think of other questions, because we are going to move on to the next section, write them down. We can come back to them at the end if we have time, or you can also do it in the informal section. So we're going to move on to Liz, helping us walk through the Western Oregon HCP mission, vision, and goals. And Troy, can you do my thing? And we'll give her this, I think, first sitting. It's easier. And then when we click into Q&A.
Okay. I'm going to learn the technology here for a minute. Is that on? Okay. All right. Okay. So the next part of our agenda here is to go over the HCP mission, vision, and goals. And just to set the table, thank you. Let me explain a little bit about this exercise that we've gone through. The mission, vision, and goals describe the objectives for the HCP, and we've formulated these in a collaborative approach through our steering committee and our scoping team. And so again, that has representation from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, ODFW, DEQ, DSL. Who am I forgetting? OSU. So it was a really good process, and we spent a fair amount of time really digging into these to make sure that we arrived at a place where all of those agencies were comfortable and felt like our respective mandates, laws, and missions were reflected. So again, they've gone through our steering committee and our scoping team, the scoping team being our technical folks from those same agencies. I think there's a few take homes I would put on the table for you. One is that we're trying to achieve multiple objectives with the Habitat Conservation Plan. So conservation, obviously, critical to the objectives of what we're trying to do, but we're also very clear that these are working for us. And as such, there are economic and social commitments that we're making through the management of these forests as well. So really want to be clear about that. So today what we're going to do is share these, the mission, vision, and goals that have been approved by the steering committee and the scoping team. And we're hoping to get some feedback from you all and really try to hear from you how these resonate with you. This one? Okay, so just a little bit around what makes for a good mission, vision, and goal statements. So to state the obvious, I think the mission tends to concentrate on the present and sort of critical processes. Vision statements focus on the future, and goals really dig down into what is it that we're trying to accomplish and the results that we'd like to achieve. So with that, and unless folks want me to read through this, I think I'll just hit the highlights, and we can always come back and dig into this more if you'd like. But in terms of the mission for the Habitat Conservation Plan, it really hits a couple of these high points that I just spoke about. And one is the protection and conservation of the species that we're applying for an incidental take permit for, and that are or might be listed under the ESA. That we are providing for long-term management of these lands for multiple benefits. And we typically talk about those in state forest mandates and rules as greatest permanent value. And again, that's kind of shorthand for environmental, social, and economic benefits. We are also at this point working collaboratively with Department of State Lands to continue to evaluate the parcels that we manage for DSL. So those are common school forest lands, continuing to evaluate as we move through this process, which, if any of those parcels would be covered under the HCP. And they have a different mandate, and that mandate expressly references fiduciary responsibilities and maximizing revenue. So that's why you see that in there as well. And then finally, that the mission is that it would meet specific criteria that have to satisfy National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order for them to issue the incidental take permit. So that's the mission. In terms of the vision, you'll see that that tracks real closely with the mission. So we want to ensure that species are protected and that there's conservation of the species with increased certainty that we'll be able to manage for the benefits of all Oregonians. And again, that's real central to our mandate under greatest permanent value. That it's a multi-objective HCP. And then there's, I would point out, I should say, that we then go into a list really of what I would describe as social benefits. And so spending some time here in the vision statement, highlighting that in terms of revenues to the counties and rural communities, revenue for the Common School Fund, jobs, being important social benefits, and then from a conservation perspective, supporting resilient forests, high quality habitat for fish and wildlife, and high quality air and water. Those of you in the room are probably aware that in terms of our state forest land base, the Board of Forestry Lands, we also provide a recreation program. And so we're referencing that as well in the vision, and an educational program through our Tillamook Forest Center. So really in this, in the vision statement, wanting to hit on all those aspects of what we provide off of the management of state forests. So that's the vision statement. And then we have 6 goals. And so again, I'll hit just the high points of these. So in the first goal, our goal is to meet the regulatory requirements of the state and federal Endangered Species Act. That in doing so, the Habitat Conservation Plan in our second goal is going to ensure active and sustainable management of these lands to achieve greatest permanent value. And in the case of DSL, also meet the fiduciary responsibilities to the degree that those parcels are included in the Habitat Conservation Plan. It's important for us to have operational certainty. Yes. Oh, thank you. It's a lot. No, thank you. One of the clear benefits of two clear benefits of Habitat Conservation Plan that's important for folks to recognize is the assurances for conservation over the long term for these species and contributing to recovery, as well as the assurances to manage the forests that we really need as a state forest organization. And so those are 2 huge benefits of an incidental take permit that we don't have under our current approach with take avoidance. So operational certainty is highlighted there in the third goal. And again, reference to those social benefits that we need to provide from the management of these forests. In the fourth goal, the focus here is on increased certainty for the long-term persistence of the covered species by protecting their habitats, conducting restoration enhancement projects, and mitigating the impacts of the covered species. And then in the fifth goal, we focused on the importance of partnerships and engagement. And that, you know, you'll see quite the laundry list there, but we felt it was important to highlight those. It really demonstrates the breadth and depth of the work and goals that we endeavor to achieve under the Habitat Conservation Plan, and recognizing that we're more likely, have a greater likelihood of achieving all that if we maintain, create and maintain good partnerships. And then finally, in the sixth goal there, clearly a long-term tenet for management of state forest lands in Oregon is a science-based approach to forestry that's linked to adaptive management. So that, in sort of rapid fashion, is the mission, vision, and goals. And with that, we'll pause and take any questions people might have. Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries. Just kind of, we tried to warm it up with these questions.
So, so is there anything missing? So here you can see the full set of questions there. Anything missing in the mission, vision, and goals? Do they reflect what we're seeking to accomplish in an HCP? And do you see the range of objectives and interests reflected in the goals?
Hi, Bob Van Dyke. Thank you, Liz, for that. I have 2 questions. I think one is are these required by the HCP, or did you guys just decide to do these, or sort of where do they fit in terms of being needed or optional?
Also, I think I'm correct in saying that, yes, they're required to be in the Habitat Conservation Plan. They're highly recommended.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I guess, secondly, there's similar language about mission and vision and goals in the forest management plan.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the planning stuff you have been presenting, and is there I assume these are connected, or are they supposed to be connected, or do they feel separate, or just wondering how the mission, vision, goals language might connect to the forest management
Yeah.
plan, mission,
Great.
vision, goals stuff
Great.
that's also being discussed. Thank
Okay,
you.
yeah, great. Thank you, Bob. That's exactly right. And I think the reason that we see that those common themes reflected in the HCP set here as are reflected in our forest management plan is because of linkage to our mandates to manage for greatest permanent value. So there's going to be strong overlap there in terms of the environmental, social, and economic goals. And the same is true for managing for those common school forest lands. So that'll track throughout with both of those planning documents. And then the places where they really diverge is operating with the programmatic ESA compliance tool. And that's where you see the long-term assurances to manage. So definitely a lot of overlap, but there's that departure. Age before beauty.
I'm deaf. Dave Ivanov. Liz, the one thing that I see mentioned, at least anecdotally, in number 5 is forest conditions and health, but it seems that that goal 5 is somewhat passive as opposed to a really proactive approach that, you know, about 20% of the land out there is in a state of being underproductive, and unless active management is undertaken, you know, future generations of Oregonians are going to be left with a legacy of, you know, 150,000 acres that are in really tough condition, and it seems to me like that should be a high priority, that all these lands are brought into full productivity. Just a comment.
Thank you, Dave. And we have been talking about that quite a bit in other venues. For those of you in the room that haven't been a part of those discussions, I think you're referencing the Tillamook State Forest, where we've got pretty severe instances of Swiss needlecast and large acreages in aging alder. And when you roll those up together, there are some legitimate concerns about the near-term and long-term forest health and the ability to meet the full suite of mission and goals. So I think that's right, and we're all tracking that. And in the goals here, we do reference the importance of enhancement and restoration projects, and I think that's a goal we could link to with that type of with those types of forest conditions, Dave.
Restoration of those acres is still part of the long-term vision, is it not?
It is, and again, the strategies to get there are yet to play out through the work that's been done.
Liz, what's the state's obligation under the Endangered Species Act?
I'll turn that over to make sure we are referencing the letter of the law.
Yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I'll tell you my perspective on that. I mean, the state's, just like any landowner, the state is obligated to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And they've been doing so to date in one way, which is to attempt to avoid take of those species. And I think what we found collectively, and then in looking at the business case last year, the outlook for that strategy is not great in terms of continuing to generate revenue in a predictable way over time. And so that's why, you know, the state ODF, if I can speak on their behalf, is thinking about doing that in a different way, and that is through getting a permit under using an HCP. So there's multiple ways to comply with the Endangered Species Act, but just like any landowner, the state's required to do that.
The reason I ask is, as I read through this, it sounds like you're going to go further towards species recovery than required. And it seems like that ought to be made clear in the mission, vision, and goals, is that this HCP is obligating the state to do more than it's required under the Endangered Species Act towards the recovery of species. So that's my comment about the mission, vision, and goals.
Yeah, that's a great point. You are correct that the language the requirements of the language are very specific: avoid and minimize and mitigate, right, to the maximum extent practicable. That is the standard. There is more in here than that, and
Well,
I think
it's not clear there is, but I think you're
Okay,
saying
yeah,
there is, but
yeah.
it ought to be clear. That's my point.
that's great feedback. Yeah, we can take a look at that for sure. I mean, I do think that one of the main purposes of this document was to allow, when people are interacting with the HCP, allow people to understand that I mean, we all understand this, but not everybody might, that there's a lot of other factors at play here than just endangered species. Even though the HCP is focused on compliance with the Endangered Species Act and on the covered species that we're talking about, there are a lot of other factors at play. So I think part of this was just trying to make that clear, but you're right that maybe the standard could be clear.
Yeah, I think it should.
Yeah.
How many others have questions, comments, feedback on this topic? Okay, so a couple more, 2, 3.
So as I see it, my name is Joe Kirkfleet. The ESA has two goals in sort of general terms. One is to prevent extinctions of species, and the other is to promote their recovery so they don't have to come under the onus of the Endangered Species Act. And as far as I can tell, section or goal 4 talks about persistence of species, which kind of says to me we keep them from going extinct. But I don't see any mention of recovery or promoting more larger populations or more resilient populations of these species. So that's my comment.
Yeah, that's good. If I could weigh in on it, I think that's a great observation actually, and kind of does get back to the previous comment, which is thinking about the standards that we're trying to manage to here. The word persistence was chosen on purpose. And that is for two reasons. One, the standard isn't that we have to recover the species or even contribute to the recovery, even though all of the conservation actions that will be done certainly will contribute to the recovery of the species. But it's not a requirement that an HCP completes the recovery of the species. The other part of that is that we know, and I was showing some of those maps earlier, we know that just simply based on the distribution of the species and the portion of the range of a species that is on state lands, there's only so much that can be done on state lands from a conservation perspective that will benefit those species. The state doesn't own all of the lands within the range of any of the species. So there is a limit to that. So the word persistence in number 4 really was getting at that. That's what we're striving for, is to make sure that at least under this HCP, we're going to make sure that the species that are there now are going to persist there in the future. And that's about as strong of a statement as we can make without, committing to doing more. So it kind of gets back. No, I don't think so. Conducting habitat enhancement activities in areas of lower habitat, that's simply one of the mechanisms that we would use to allow the species to persist, I think, and to build some flexibility in across the landscape about how it might be managed for timber harvest and other activities over time. So, in some cases, just to be specific about that, if you wanted to harvest some areas, you may have to enhance others, right, to keep that balance and to keep that persistence of the species on the landscape. So that's really what that's after.
And that phrase also speaks to forest restoration that Dave was getting at, for example, in the Swiss needle cast areas. Those aren't providing great habitat right now, but could.
My name is Rex Storm. The question I had is about the vision statement. Although it's implied under the goals under number 2, I'm a little for a loss of looking for in the vision of the protecting the sustainable flow of activities, of those multi-objective activities. I would think it'd be very important. Part of the vision is not only do we have a current set of activities, but we sustain those activities into the future. So the perpetuation not only of the species is important, but the perpetuation of the flow of activities and benefits from the state forests, I think, need to be or I guess I would recommend that you make that more clear that that is also important, even though I think you apply that in goal number 2.
Are you, thank you, Rex. Appreciate that. And so are you talking about the vision then? At
Yeah,
that,
and the
needing that
vision.
in the vision? And do you think that, so if we look at that first sentence, the HCP ensures protection and conservation as well as increased certainty that working forests will continue to benefit all Oregonians? Do you think that needs, are you saying you'd like to see that be more
Yeah,
clear?
that's just, it's very vague. To me, it's not clear.
And the language that you feel more comfortable, that you think is more clear is you had a
Well,
couple.
when you start talking about the multi-objective activities in the vision,
Yeah.
it seems to be a separate topic that is different than the first sentence, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay.
It still didn't come out very clear. Persistence. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mike Marsotti, also in the vision statement, in the multi-objective forest stewardship activities, you list a variety of the outcomes from that activity. Is carbon part of that?
So, right, it's not called out specifically, but clearly forests sequester carbon. So I think I would say it's part of a holistic perspective on resilient forest ecosystems.
I mean, you list in the last sentence there, you list off what some of those outcomes are.
Right.
I just wondered if you were
To add.
also going to add that.
Okay. It hadn't come up. So that's good feedback.
The HCP isn't about carbon, as Mark said. Yeah, it's what Mark said is right. I mean, that's not the kind of thing it would be discussed in the HCP. Again, going back to what was said earlier, it's focused more on the covered species and sort of the world through the lens of the covered species. So carbon would be something separate.
Clean air, for example.
Mhm.
I don't see how clean air would be
Yeah.
part of that either.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, my thoughts on that about carbon specifically is there's a general statement about, providing revenue. We don't really elaborate on why or what that is. It could be from multiple sources probably, so that could be part of that.
Yeah, so a couple things. So I hadn't thought of it that way, that this is maybe more part of a plan. And a couple of notes I'd want to add to that is every HCP is coupled with a forest management plan. So other activities that don't need to be covered for the incidental take permit and other objectives that we're meeting would be incorporated into the companion forest management plan. We're revising our current forest management plan right now. And we've incorporated, the board has approved a guiding principle that speaks specifically to climate change and carbon sequestration. Should the board decide to continue working on the HCP, parts of that work we're doing in the revised forest management plan would carry over into that companion piece with the HCP, which would call out the carbon piece. So yeah, that's a good conversation.
When you mention clean air, it seems like you open the door to other issues that
Yeah.
are unrelated to these.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah, and I would just, on that train of thought, when we're listing sort of a laundry list of benefits that we would see from an overall HCP and its companion FMP here. And so I think that we can certainly consider that. And just so process-wise, and I'm sure that I'm probably stealing Deb's thunder a little bit here, but the steering committee worked really hard on these goals. So to get a group in the room and actually doing like editing on the screen, but are open to your feedback. And so we're going to sit down with the steering committee with this feedback and look at how we might be able to make some changes to be responsive to some of this. Also wanted to point out that these, the mission, vision, and goals were reviewed by our scoping team members. Many of them are here today. And it was pointed out that in the vision as well, a couple of pieces that might be on some of your minds are commercial fisheries and hunting are also a couple of things that were left off of this laundry list that we're going to be considering as well. And so the next time that we would come back to you, we would let you know, based on your feedback, what the steering committee thought of that, whether or not it was appropriate to, they felt they needed to include it. So we'll come back with an updated version for you.
That's great. Thank you. And so just a couple other quick process pieces. So you can track how these documents move. At the top of this one, it says final draft approved by the steering committee, like Cindy just said, on April 30th. So now what happens is we take good notes at these meetings, we bring them back to the steering committee, and the scoping team even gets another run at it. And ultimately, the steering committee will consider all the feedback. And it is true what Cindy said. It's a painful kind of art and scientific exercise to wordsmith documents as a group. And so finding those words that really resonate enough, but you can live with it, is as good as you really get in those venues. And this is exactly what we wished for. We wanted more reflection and more feedback because these documents are iterative and they're never really going to be perfect, but we want it to be good enough to be reflective of where they're trying to go. That's what mission, vision, and goals get for you, right? And we also hope that by the end and 20, 30 years out, it's also a bit of a guidepost to take you places and use to ground yourself. So thank you for that. Really helpful. And again, after we're finished, if you have more you want to say, or either write it down on the cards if there's things you just didn't get a chance to say and you want to give us as feedback. Okay, so I think we're good on this section. Thank you, everyone. And we're to the third piece of the agenda, which is on stakeholder engagement. So Sylvia needs microphone and the clicker. I think we just need the stand for her. I might get out of here too. Yeah, I think we're going to get out of your way, Sylvia. Okay. Actually, do you want to hold it? Just stand up.
All right. Okay, so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the stakeholder engagement and communications plan. For those of you who were at our meeting in March, you'll remember we just broadly talked about stakeholder engagement, and we were kind of in the process of having some stakeholder interviews with many of the folks that are in this room, and kind of deciding on what the stakeholder engagement process was. And so we thank you all for your feedback and thoughts on how to shape a process. And we've developed a plan that you have in your meeting packets. And I'm not going to go through the entire plan, but we just want to hit on some of the highlights so that you understand the purpose of the public engagement and what to expect with the activities and the timeline for the next 9 to 12 months or so. So on one of the first pages of the plan, you'll see the communications and stakeholder engagement goals. So we have several goals. We wanted to include every goal under the sun, but somehow narrowed it down to just about 8 or 10. But we see the stakeholder engagement and public process as an opportunity to provide feedback at key points where we think it's most important for you to provide that input. We also want to make sure that we're engaging the counties that have a special relationship with ODF as part of the FTLAC and through other venues as appropriate. We want to make sure that interested parties are informed, even if they're not able to come to meetings and participate, so that they have information along the way through regular updates. And we hope to provide venues where diverse interests can hear and learn from one another and kind of sit in each other's shoes and understand the diverse perspectives in the room. We also want to be clear about expectations for how your input will be used, and we'll try to be clear about that. Just right now, we kind of explain how your input on the mission, vision, and goals will be used. And if at any point it's not clear how your input will be used, we hope that you tell us along the way so that we have that transparent communication moving forward. We also want to build a common understanding on how the HCP will be developed and implemented, so we're all working off of the same information and understanding there. And we do want to align this engagement with the FMP process. We know that there can be a lot of confusion between the two, so we're trying our best to explain the differences between the two processes and align them where appropriate. And we also want to make sure that you're informed enough throughout the process so that when NEPA occurs later in 2020, you are well informed and are able to provide comment and engage in that process as best you can. So this is these are the basic elements of the process and the different actors and bodies involved, which you have probably seen before at previous meetings, but we'll go over this again as well. So the HCP process includes the public stakeholders and the FTLAC, all of whom provide input to ODF and to the project team, and really to everyone here, the steering committee, the scoping team. And ODF will develop kind of staff recommendations for the HCP that then are brought to the Board of Forestry, and the Board of Forestry will make a final decision on whether to move forward with an incidental take permit at the end of this process. And along the way, the steering committee and the scoping team are meeting regularly. The scoping team is made up of state and federal agencies, and they provide technical guidance and help make technical recommendations and work jointly with Troy and with ODF to work on those technical pieces. And then the steering committee is composed again of state and federal agencies, and they advise on HCP development and provide guidance to the scoping team along the way. And so here, on the left-hand side, we have the FTLAC public and stakeholder engagement. So, what does that look like? We have a process for stakeholder and public engagement that really includes 4 key components. First are meetings open to the public, so meetings like this, and we hope to hold these approximately quarterly, and they'll provide an opportunity to hear updates on the process and to discuss key topics that are kind of technically ready for discussion along the way. And then we will also have targeted stakeholder engagement meetings and activities, and I'll explain that a little bit later on the next slide, but these will be opportunities for deeper level dives into topics on the HCP. And there will also be meetings of existing venues along the way. So there are scheduled check-ins and updates with the Board of Forestry and the FTLAC, everyone knows what that is, right? Forest Trust Lands Advisory Committee, and the stakeholder roundtable that accompanies those meetings, as well as the State Forest Advisory Committee and other bodies that ODF engages with regularly. And we also will be having regular communications and public information through email updates and the website that will be up to date with documents that are available. So this slide here is really the core of the stakeholder engagement process, and that's in your meeting plan, I think on page 10. I can't remember the exact page, but it's dark. Anyway, 10, okay, thank you. So on page 10 of the stakeholder engagement plan, so this lays out where we expect to have these kinds of meetings, these meetings open to the public that are shown in that home plate blue symbol. So we started with a public kickoff meeting back in March, which really introduced the process. And now we are at this June public meeting, meeting open to the public, providing more updates. And you'll see just along the way, we have meetings open to the public approximately quarterly. And each of those is followed up with stakeholder engagement. And we thought about the process a lot. We considered, having a regular advisory committee. We considered having focus group meetings. We considered one-on-one conversations. And when we really stepped back, we wanted a process that was flexible and responsive to what you all want to talk about. So our hope is that during and after each of these meetings open to the public, we can ask you what from these updates and what from you heard is most important to you to continue to engage on, and how do you want to have that engagement. So we expect this kind of flexible piece of stakeholder engagement after each meeting open to the public. And that could be focus groups, it could be one-on-one conversations, small group meetings. We really just want to keep it flexible to what would be most valuable as a venue for you. And so you'll see that, when we have this up here as well, after today's meeting, we expect follow-up conversation on any of the topics that were brought up today. And then we'll have a board check-in a check-in with the Board of Forestry in fall of 2019. I think it's September 6th or September 4th. And then again, that'll be followed by another meeting open to the public and stakeholder engagement, sort of just in that general order. And the topics that are likely to be covered at those meetings will follow the technical schedule that Troy laid out earlier. So whenever those topics are ready for discussion, we'll have updates and conversation on that. So that's the stakeholder engagement plan in a nutshell. And so we want to open it up to discussion and your thoughts. And we have two key questions for you. One is just general reflections on the plan. And then specifically going forward for maybe the next 2 or 3 months, what topics from today's meeting do you want to be engaged on and how, or anything that you want more information on?
So just to add one more clarifying bit of information, at our last public meeting or meeting open to the public, Liz did a really good job of kind of saying who is on this team, who the we is. And I realize there's some new faces this time. Many of you are back and many of you kind of know how project teams work, but it might be nice just to say again, you know, this is ODF's project. This is Oregon Department of Forestry's project. They're moving this forward and they have engaged consultants to support your work. Do you mind? So I'm not saying what I
Sure. Yeah, I realized on a couple topics today, we kind of dove right in feeling like everyone was starting from the same spot. So it might be worth backing up on a couple of things. So that's a great point. It is an Oregon Department of Forestry project. We're working closely with Department of State Lands because of our shared relationship for managing those common school forest lands. We've worked on HCPs in the past. And based on that experience, we did a couple of things differently this time. One was the formation and a very deliberate process of working with our sister state and federal agencies to create this framework. We've talked about the steering committee and the scoping team to be a really solid place to get our work done and make decisions. So I want to emphasize it is our project, and the coordination with those sister agencies is critical to the success. So there's that. We also know that it takes a lot of resources to get an HCP across the finish line, and to be just frank about it, State Forest does not have those level of resources internally. And there is a lot of expertise to efficiently and effectively work through an HCP. So for those reasons, we put together the team that we've all, that you've seen up here in front of you today. So Cindy is our project manager. She's with the Department of Forestry, and she's herding all the cats and moving parts and keeping us all in line. Troy is representing ICF, and that's the group of consultants that's, as you can tell, really responsible for getting that HCP together, keeping the chapters moving, helping us know what needs to be in the chapters, helping us write those chapters, really critical. A lot of experience with HCPs around the country. So that's a great resource for us. And then a recognition as well of the importance of working with the public and stakeholders, because ultimately this is a science-based, conservation-based program, right? A habitat conservation plan, but it's also a social agreement. And so really wanting to have effective engagement with our stakeholders and the public, having a facilitator help us with that through Kearns and West, and with Deb and Sylvia here today, and Michelle helping out as well. That's a resource that enables us to step back and look out for our objectives and what, our experience as a landowner, where we need to go. We can step back and have the resource in Kearns and West to facilitate these conversations. And then Brett Brownscombe with Oregon Consensus brings a similar skill set to our team, and additionally helps us sort of maneuver at a larger scale to move this through a process that involves the Board of Forestry, the governor's office. I mean, a much sort of, I'd say, larger scale conversation at the state level to assure alignment and support. And the governor's office, to be clear, has been very clear for her support for our pursuit of an HCP. Is that good? And then one other backup, and I'm sorry for this, but we've talked about the forest management plan today and the HCP. We've talked about common school forest lands and DSL. So real briefly, we talked about this before, but again, for the new faces in the room, we currently manage our state forest lands under our forest management plan with the take avoidance strategy. Under that same plan, we also manage 33,000 acres of common school forest land. That's why you'll hear us kind of going back and forth. Those lands are managed under a different mandate, but we have a management agreement with DSL to do that work. So the sort of at play here right now is the final decision around, again, what percent, if any, of those parcels will end up being covered under an HCP. And we're just working real closely with DSL and ICF as we move through that process. The forest management plan that we have right now, we're also working as directed from our Board of Forestry on a revision to that forest management plan. The assumption would be that that would be a take avoidance plan. And the direction from the board is that any revision has to increase financial outcomes and conservation outcomes. So we are in parallel working on a revision to the forest management plan and an HCP. And what we want to be clear about is that ultimately when the board makes a decision of which route they finally want us to go, which we're targeting for next summer, any, excuse me, any work that's been done on the forest management plan, we anticipate there will be some portion of that which would just sort of parlay over into the companion forest management plan that goes with an HCP. So it's convoluted and we're doing our best to try to get good at explaining it, but that's the story. Good? Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Questions, comments, feedback on the stakeholder engagement plan? Just raise up your hand so somebody knows. Okay, yes.
I have a question. The steering committee meetings, this is Mark Rasmussen. The steering committee meetings, are they open to the public?
No, they are not. Wait, listen. Thank you.
Sure. You just hold that. That's good.
Okay. Those meetings are not open to the public. They are for the sort of the decision makers to be able to have a space to work through some really complex issues. And so we're on a really tight timeline. Something that I think Barrett brought up at our last public meeting is it's great that you want to involve all of the stakeholders and have an engaged public, but the more you bring people into a process, the longer that might take the process. So we're trying to make sure that we're efficient with our planning teams, give them the space that they need to work, and also give the stakeholders an opportunity to engage in a way that's meaningful for them.
But could someone go and just observe and not participate?
Right now, we don't have that space open.
Okay.
So could I say on that? I mean, part of this is Kearns and West and Oregon Consensus, Brett Brownscombe, Deb, Sylvia, the team who are not ODF, kind of the outsiders. We're not, a consultation agency. We're not an action agency. It's we're trying to do this plan in the process and engagement part because this is all being built on a foundation of this stuff's been tried before, hasn't worked. There's litigation coming from multiple directions and a lot of controversy around what ODF is or isn't doing on state forest lands. And so part of the recognition is we're trying to do something that is at a moment in time right now, but if you look back on it 10 years down the road, are we going to be able to look back and say this was different, this resulted in meeting interests that are in the room today? And so even if those meetings aren't open, I think like we're trying to provide the venues where people can say what's on their mind. Like what is it that you need steering committee members or people who are ultimately going to be proposing something to Board of Forestry, or even there are a lot of steering committee members in the room today. What do you need them to hear? We want to make sure we've got the venues, and that's what this plan's all about, to be sure that people can say their piece, and then ideally a product comes out of this that is more reflective of broader interests and quote unquote works for everybody, even though it's maybe not going to be anybody's one particular perfect thing.
Yeah.
And that all works under FACA and APA and all that.
It does.
But-
Yes, we've had a legal opinion on that, so we're there. But I do want to let you know that something that was brought up in our previous public meeting was wondering if you could have access to the notes, the minutes from those meetings that we're having with our steering committee and our scoping team. And so in the spirit of transparency, they've agreed to that. So that's now up on our website. So, and I would offer that if, as you're perusing those, if you have any questions about those or you want to talk to me about them, please feel free to contact me.
Thanks. Barrett Brown, I'm in listening to some of the comments, I've become attentive to some tripping hazards here. People will tend to come to this process later and later and later. And with the content on YouTube, for example, those of us who are here from the start tend to evolve our expectations for our interests. We start to understand why we may understand the way we debit our interests, whereas somebody coming later will not understand those. So I wonder if, Jason, referring to parts at the beginning of these videos, if you refer to parts 1, parts 2, and kind of direct people that just to set their expectations that they may be disappointed they pop in now and not have that background. One example is, I know everybody understands this in the room, but a species that doesn't make the list doesn't mean that those are the winners. And if you're not on the list, you're not protected. It just means that's a species that has been identified. And also the department will be seeking a permit, a permit. The services will still have take avoidance coming your way as the protection regimens develop naturally. So the listener who pops in today may think, hey, my species didn't make the list. That's not protected, and that would be a misunderstanding.
And any thoughts on topics or topics of the HCP that were brought up today that you want to really engage in over the next few months? Was there anything that you really want to make sure that we are able to talk to stakeholders and to the public about over the next few months?
So maybe we could just give a little sort of reminder of the things that we talked about today. And some of those are the species list and their existing conditions, so the data that we're using to look at the populations and what the potential conservation benefits that we're currently providing are and what those gaps might be. So that's something that we talked about. Stop me when I'm off the topic. Also, we talked about our covered activities. So that would be the forest management activities that we would be engaged in that would be have some take coverage in the HCP. And so that would be things such as, forest management actually, so thinning and logging, those types of things, as well as road construction and road maintenance, and the list that is in your PowerPoint there. So those are some things that you might be interested in. What else comes to mind? Oh, the plan area and the permit area. If you have any questions about those things.
And during and I'll pass to Chandra, and during the next hour, we do hope that during our one-on-one conversations, if you think about something that you want to make sure to engage on, we can have those conversations then as well.
Hi, Chandra Fry with Trout Unlimited. I think we're just interested on the topics that you had noted in the adaptive management portion and the development of the biological goals and objectives and how that's going to drive your adaptive management decisions and what your governance structure looks like for that. So we'd be interested in being kept in the loop on that one.
Anybody else?
I'm wondering about how this HCP fits with the HCP for the Elliott. Will it be exactly the same or
No.
quite different? Or why would you have one set of conservation
so-
managers one place and another place?
Right. HCPs are linked to the landowner and the landowner objectives and the covered activities. And right now, the DSL is pursuing the notion that Oregon State University will own the Elliott as and manage it as a research forest. And so those are going to be, that's going to result in a different set of objectives and probably covered activities than what we'd be doing under a sort of a working forest set of objectives. So different objectives, different landowner. There's some overlap, obviously, because of the relationship that we have between ODF and DSL. And then ICF is also supporting that HCP process with the Elliott. But they are separate efforts and obviously separate owners and separate objectives.
Bill, do you want to say anything on that, or Nancy from DSL, or that was right on?
You look like you still have a question, Mark. Okay.
So first I just want to say, because Bill didn't have a microphone, that Bill Ryan just said that was it,
That
right?
Liz is always right.
Yeah. He did not say Liz is always right. He said, well done. Said nothing else to add at this point. Is that? Yes, but if you have additional questions, find Bill and he'll definitely keep talking about it with you. Good.
So I'm trying to clarify that response. Sorry, Seth Barnes, OFIC. So Liz and team, can we expect different habitat provisions on the Elliott? I mean, to put a finer point on it, can we expect different provisions on the Elliott versus the North Coast forests? Or is it just HCP is different? These are two different landscapes. Is that semantics or is it material?
So I don't think it's semantics. The way it will play out materially is yet to be seen. I don't know how the OSU plans to set up their research projects. Are they going to do research in the context of management or management in the context of research? Those are going to result in sort of different outcomes and different needs for coverage. So I can't speak at all to the direction that would be going. And clearly we're still in the pathway on our own conservation strategies. So I really can't answer at this point. And caught up here. So maybe we could. Yeah.
I didn't think I'd be able to escape. Bottom line is the different management objectives are critical here. And so for a research forest, we're still figuring out what does that mean, and what does that mean in terms of what activities that we want to have covered. But I can tell you in terms of the overall objectives, I mean, the plan for the Elliott at this point is that it's a research forest that will have harvest as a component of it, but it's not going to be a forest that's managed for harvest that they're going to be doing research on. And I know that at this point that's kind of semantics because we really don't know what that means on the ground. I think you can say that in terms of what types of conservation activities will work for the species, we have similar species. The Elliott, we're actually only covering the marbled murrelet and the northern spotted owl and the coho. So we don't have as large a suite of species that we're covering with the Elliott HCP, but the conservation strategies I think will be similar, but where and how much and that sort of thing are going to be quite different, I anticipate. But we don't really have the details of what those covered activities are, in particular for the Elliott at this point yet. Those are coming soon though. So I mean, we've got this summer we should have a pretty good handle on what that is. And we've got our own public process and outreach and information sharing regarding that process.
Any others?
Rex Storm again. I apologize, I wasn't here for your discussion of covered activities, but I would presume that looking at the slide that you would cover all those existing ongoing activities your language would discuss this, all those existing envisioned activities. Because it always makes me nervous when I see a bullet list with 5 or 6 items on it, because usually there are 20 or 30 items that should be listed if you have an individual list. And so I would hope you'd have sufficient language, because I do notice there are some things that aren't on that list.
Yeah.
Periodically happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we try to summarize it in a way on the slide, but you're right. There's quite a lot of detail. And I mentioned earlier, one of the things we're doing right now is actually working with the various districts to not only make sure the list is right, but if there are, if there's variability just in methodology and how they do things in different parts of the permit area, that we capture that as well. So there's not only more detail about the activities, but really even how they're done on the landscape.
Yes, one more.
So Liz, in other meetings, you've talked about off-ramps, and there was no discussion of that today in the scheduling of things. And maybe that's not an appropriate topic for this group, but are we beyond the off-ramps, or are there still off-ramps, and what's that process look like?
That's a great reminder for folks here in the room. So I referenced the 2 planning processes that we're under with revising the forest management plan and writing this HCP. And so maybe we call them off ramps, I'm not sure, but what I will say is that in March of next year, that's the intent, hopefully we meet that timeline, we'll go to the Board of Forestry with that proposed revision to a forest management plan. And we will have done an analysis to determine if we have a revised plan that both increases conservation and financial outcomes. And we'll be asking the board, here's what we think the outcomes are going to be, and we'll be asking them for a decision, which is, do you think this plan meets the twin goals or not? The revision meets the twin goals. At that point, if the determination is yes, you've been able to revise the plan to meet those twin goals, we would put that on a side burner. It's going to sit here while we continue working through the habitat conservation plan, because the timeline that Troy showed earlier is that in July of next year is when we'll have the work completed to be able to go to the Board of Forestry and say, here's a draft, administrative draft of the HCP. So at that point, they will have had the conversation about a take avoidance plan, and we will have now come up with a draft HCP, and we'll be asking them in July, do you want us to continue now moving into NEPA and all the various and sundry parts that come along with continuing to work on an HCP? Or do you want us to pick up our take avoidance plan and continue moving that through a rulemaking process? So that, I think, is the important, maybe is the terminology off-ramp that you're calling, but to me, it's really looking for where do we go from here, that we need to, by that point, be working towards one approach or another, either an incidental take permit or take avoidance. But that by this time next year, we're just doing one or the other.
As far as you may have said it, I missed it, but I'm sorry. Liz, in the spring of next year, you're going to ask the board to render an opinion as to whether or not your revised FMP meets the twin goals, and if so, then you're going to set it on the side burner. And what I missed is, when will you then ask the board to evaluate the HCP as opposed to asking the board to approve going through the NEPA process?
Oh, great. Yeah, good. Thank you for that clarification. That is in July. So in July, we'll bring an evaluation to them of the financial and conservation outcomes of the draft HCP as compared to the revised forest management plan. So that's the analysis at that point.
So the HCP, the specificity with respect to the HCP, we're not going to see till July of 2020. Is that correct?
Well,
I guess in terms of volume and annual harvest levels, et cetera.
You'll be seeing that throughout this process during phase 2. So by the time we go to the board in July of 2020, you will have been exposed to all of the work products that are in the chapters of the draft. So you'll be engaged in that. And I think that the timber management strategies and revenue are more around the winter.
Yeah, late fall.
The late fall, early winter. And so
in terms of timber outputs under the HCP, we'll have an idea of that
Yeah.
this fall and winter.
Yeah, and remember, because that is, though we listed a few different types of covered activities, I mean, one of the main ones is timber harvest. And so part of the exercise that we're just starting on now, and I've been talking about things like effects analysis, et cetera, but I mean, a big part of that is what is the timber harvest going to look like under the HCP? So yeah, so we'll be working through that throughout the year here.
Okay, thank you.
And just as a reminder, in terms of that off-ramp discussion, the way that we set up this HCP was this 3-phased approach. And the first phase was that HCP initiation and scoping, and it included the business case analysis. And we took that to the board, as many of you are aware, in November of 2018. And that was an off-ramp. And so they got to decide whether or not, based on what we brought to them, if they wanted to move forward with phase 2, which is what we kind of shorthand term call strategy development. So that's conservation and timber management strategies. As you see, there's a lot more that goes into phase 2. And so when we bring this to the board in July of 2020, another off-ramp. So they get to decide whether or not it's in the best interest of the state to continue working on the HCP. If they decide that, yes, it is, that it's intriguing enough to move forward, we would go on to the NEPA process. We'll see what that brings. And if in the NEPA process significant changes occur to the HCP, you know, the board would decide not to move forward with an HCP. So at the end of phase 3, which is that NEPA process, we would bring the complete HCP to the board in November of 2021. And that's that final off-ramp of, okay, now we have everything, it's vetted through the public, it's gone through the NEPA process, we know what the services are expecting, and that would be that final off-ramp.
Great, thank you. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Great questions, great listening, great feedback, really, really helpful. Remember, you can look on the website if you want to see any of the both meeting summaries, but also these meeting summaries go there. And I really want to appreciate the process ideas. We will help modify how we do these meetings. You're already helping us as we go forward with this, kind of beginning with a reminder of where we've been, but we'll get more specific with you about that and give people touch points to catch up, what we're doing. And at the end, we'll be more specific about kind of what you can anticipate. So this time, what we want you to know is, as Sylvia said, the next board meeting is September 4th. The next meeting like this, the open to the public meeting, will likely be around October-ish. So in the fall, okay? And in between, and we're going to end in just a minute. I'm going to hand it back to Liz to say thank you and goodbye. For the formal part, we still have this last hour of informal time with you. So don't hesitate. Tell us what else you want to be talking about and when, and let us help keep moving with the stakeholder engagement process, okay? Thank you so much for your time. Yes.
And I would just add that we did have some interest in going in a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the topics. And so we'll be working with you on what that might look like between now and our next public meeting. And that might be just on a one-on-one, but if we put the call out there and more people are interested, then we would look at maybe scheduling a time to discuss those subjects.
Great. Yes, thank you. All right. And Liz, anything else?
Yeah, sure. Just to reiterate, really appreciate everyone being here. It is really important to us, and really appreciate the feedback and thoughtful input that we received. So want to make sure we continue to provide a forum that allows you to do that. So continued feedback on that is always welcome as well. So thanks again, and should be a good time.
Thank you so much. Formal meeting adjourned. Feel free to stay and visit.